Well, my name is Kerren Hosking. I'm very, very proud to be the CEO of the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to what is our third Solving Sanfilippo Symposium. Today we gather on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I, alongside the Samari community who work within this beautiful facility, acknowledge and pay respect to the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region. I acknowledge the deep connections and relationship of the Kaurna people to this country. I pay respect to the Kaurna people's ancestors, past, present and emerging leaders, and along with any First Nations people here with us today or listening online. As we all know, sovereignty has never been ceded. This was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. I've spent most of this week at conferences with other patient organisations, industry and peak health bodies, listening to people speak about the need for revolution. And we're talking about loud, fearless and collective revolution of the type to break cycles and transform how we all harness the new technologies and opportunities in healthcare and achieve change that will genuinely deliver equitable, high-quality healthcare to all Australians, including those with rare disease. But sometimes revolution is quiet. It's a fundamental change, but it may be happening behind walls, even ones resembling a cheese grater, in small teams, through new partnerships, and in the brilliant minds of researchers in every corner of our world. This symposium really helps to bring those revolutions in the field of Sanfilippo into the light. These revolutions are what are building momentum across the pillars of the global roadmap for Sanfilippo syndrome therapies in the pursuit of solutions for all Sanfilippo families. This year marks 10 years since Megan Mack, or Megan Donnell as many of you may know her, founded the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation, compelled to do so after the earth-shattering diagnosis of Sanfilippo syndrome for her two young children. In the past decade, our foundation has directed nearly $8 million into groundbreaking and promising research here in Australia and in research institutions around the world. And we've done that through the support of our families, the community, and the federal government. Today, we will hear from researchers and clinicians, many of whose work we have helped to support, and from families for whom we are all striving to find answers and solutions, and I can't wait to hear how our revolution is progressing. To all the people joining us online today, including in some very challenging time zones, I welcome you and I thank you for being part of this very important discussion. To everyone in the room here today, welcome. I'm not sure what it is about Adelaide specifically that draws together such exceptional clinicians and research talent in one place. Maybe the proximity to the Barossa, maybe, but what a boon it is for Sanfilippo and the willingness and generosity of our entire research community to share their ideas, to learn from one another and openly contribute their expertise to our shared goal of solving Sanfilippo syndrome genuinely leaves me in awe. I'd like to especially welcome the many families who are here in person and all the families joining us online. It is a big ask and a logistical challenge to take the time away from your family and your children, but we are immensely grateful that you are here. The conversations today will hopefully give some answers, but will also raise many questions, and some topics may be difficult. This is a forum for our whole community. Please ask questions, connect with each other, share your experiences and your ideas, and if you need to take time out, please do so whenever you need to. We are here to support you. I'd like to pay special thanks to Samari for generously hosting this symposium. To Cedric Barty and his team, Ella, Paris and Serena, thank you for hosting and assisting and for hosting tomorrow's lab tour with families, which is going to be very exciting. Thank you also to the generous sponsors of our event. Ultragenics has provided us with sponsorship, which is wonderful, and the CommBank Foundation for supporting parents and carers to be here in person. We will have a videographer on site later today and tomorrow as we're putting together a video to mark our 10th anniversary. I invite you all to participate in this filming. You might want to do a short interview on camera. You might want to share your reflections on the symposium and the work of the foundation. If you'd like to be involved, please tap me on the shoulder, and a heads up, I will be doing the same to some of you. I'm now going to hand you over to your MC for the symposium for the next 2 days. Dr. Lisa Melton is our Head of Research and well known to most, if not all of you. Lisa has a PhD in neuroscience, is a highly experienced and exceptional research manager and research communicator, and a fierce advocate for the Sanfilippo community. Please join me in welcoming Lisa.
Thanks, Kerren. for those kind words, and also I echo Kerren's welcome. I'm really excited that we have so many people in the room and so many people joining us online. It really shows just how much we can get done when we all work together, and I'm really excited to hear the discussions that are going to take place over the next couple of days. And now it is my great pleasure to hand over to Kellie Campbell, who is a parent of Mikayla, and she is going to tell you about their family story. We're really privileged and pleased that you can share your story. We know it's not easy to do, so thank you very much for coming today. Thank you, Kellie.
Hi, my name's Kellie Campbell. I'm here with my husband, Jamie and Jake. This is Mikayla's story. Bear with me, please. Okay, you grieve the love of a lost child, but that child is still here. You grieve the laughter and the singing that is gone, but that child is still here. You grieve what you had and is no longer here, but that child is still here. Your heart aches like never before, and you yourself are dying inside for a child gone, but that child is still here. These are the stages of grief. They're real and raw, but that child's here. Why? Why is my child in this situation? Why should anyone's child be in this situation? Any parent, carer would happily trade places with their child in a heartbeat if they knew they could give them a better life, a life that many of us take for granted. A life that has been cut so very short, and you would do anything to stop the pain and suffering that they are going through. I'm writing this as a grieving parent, a parent that had to say goodbye to their child more than once, over many years, say goodbye to who they were, who they became, and when they were gone for good. Watching your child right before your eyes is nothing that any parent, let alone anyone, should have to go through. Mikayla was 8 pound 2 and born with immature lung. She was taken to the Women's and Children's Hospital for further treatment, and she was hospitalised for another 5 days. She wasn't the easiest child to deal with, especially coming off our first child who just wanted to eat, sleep, poo, repeat. Mikayla turned us upside down. No less than 3 formula changes, and colic medicine was just the tip. She hated being held or cuddled. I had to prop her up with a pillow to feed her because she didn't want to be held. Apart from that, she was a happy child, to say the least, and as the years went by, she had this fearless way about her, and the sassy personality became more prominent. She and Jake became best mates. For siblings, that can be rare, and Jake had a patience with her that some of us parents could struggle with on occasion. As she grew, so did her confidence and her attitude. Lots of sleepless nights. She would go and go and go, and non-stop all day and all night. No matter what we tried, she just never would sleep. Eventually, she would fall asleep, sitting up, sitting in her chair, face on the carpet, anywhere. The hyperactivity she had was enormous, so much so I was afraid that she would break our back glass sliding door. But however, she grew to become fierce and strong and just amazing. She was rough and tough. She could catch a ball like nobody's business. I thought, this kid's going to be a footy player or a rugby player. She didn't mind getting dirty, and she enjoyed eating it too. She was a tough cookie though. I noticed her speech wasn't developing properly, so we invested in a speech therapist privately for 8 months. She even said, I'm not seeing much progress, and I usually see a lot of progression in some of my patients. She confirmed our fears, and Jamie and I had noticed the regression too. We started the process of trying to find out what the problem was. To say the least, it wasn't an easy process. As we sat in the paediatrician's office, an angel walked past the door, and the doctor called him in. And I'm sure he won't mind me speaking his name, but it was Dr. David Ketteridge. This beautiful little man walked in, and he was a comfort that we'd never felt with any other doctor. He was kind, and he spoke to Mikayla like she was understanding every word he was saying. Right there and then, and as my husband likes to call it, our journey started. The doctor told him about Mikayla and what he thought, and he asked him what tests we could do to keep us happy. Without actually saying it, Dr. Ketteridge proceeded with, have you noticed this? Have you noticed facial features? Have you noticed a decline? And our doctor said, oh yeah, I suppose. From there, we were officially referred to the metabolic unit. An MRI and a wee test told them everything we needed to know. As we sat in the waiting room the very next day, the area that is usually hustle and bustle with parents and carers and children waiting to see their specialists was quiet and lonely. "The Campbells are here," we heard them say, and we walked into the room and we were told, "MPS 3A, Sanfilippo syndrome." Sorry, what's that now? Please explain. "Your world comes crashing down. It pummels you into the ground. In my head, my brain's going 100 miles an hour. You're not talking about my child. You need to be in the other room telling the other child's parents that their child's dying. Not mine, Mikayla." "Terminal, I don't understand. Terminal means death. She's okay, she's good. How do we fix this? How do we fix it?" And the doctor said, "All you can do is take her home and enjoy the time you have left." Within a year of her diagnosis, Mikayla had lost her speech, was unable to blow out candles and sing happy birthday like she did the year before. We have many possessions and we got rid of all of ours for the sake of her safety and wellness. Kitchen tables went, doors blocking kitchens, knives and other missiles that she could throw. The part where she starts to fall and hurt herself comes, the part where bruises start to appear. She was a very high toe walker and always had been. So was our son Jake, so don't forget to stretch your calves, big fella. So many modifications were made on our own as well as help from Novita. She drew on walls and put holes in them as well. But they're our memories now. And such achievement of a child that was never destined to live. As time went on, more medication was added to her daily routine. She slowed down and came to rest in her chair. The feeding that Jamie had to do for hours at night were tough. While I was working, he was at home making her comfortable, as well as trying to feed our son Jake. A feeding peg was decided to allow her to eat for a novelty rather than a necessity. Jake was the most understanding child in the world. We kept him informed of every decision with Mikayla, because not only was it an adult decision, but he was a part of her life too, so we made sure that he was never left out. We had to make sure he was okay as well. Because the amount of patience he had with her was amazing, and I wanted to know that his attributes helped and they mattered because they did. He always took her away from us sometimes just to give her a break. I think the main thing is that siblings learn not only compassion, but patience and the ability to listen. That was not only taught by Jamie and I, it was also taught by Mikayla. We owe a great deal to her and her ability to teach us lessons that are some things we really don't need to stress or worry about. 13 is a number that most people associate with bad luck. We associate it with the wonder that Mikayla was. She was born on the 13th of October. She passed away on the 13th of January. She was 13 years and exactly 13 weeks old. It's been 13 years since our very first symposium for MPS. The letter M is the 13th letter of the alphabet. Mikayla would have turned 18 this October on Friday the 13th. So research has changed since Mikayla's diagnosis. We were lucky enough to meet Professor Kim Hemsley and Professor John Hopwood not long after we were told about the research being conducted at the Women's and Children's. Now here at the SAMRI, the team are increasing and growing stronger to work to find a treatment and hopefully a cure. Sanfilippo, a little known disease that no one has ever heard of, but now there are many researchers out here that know that name and are working very hard to figure out what can be done. How do we make this dream a reality for many parents? The researchers fight hard, just like us and parents, working day and night to find that little breakthrough that can make a massive difference to somebody's life. They don't give up the way that we don't give up. I'm hoping to meet all of you during this time. And if I don't, my name is Kellie Campbell, and I'd like to thank you for your hard work and dedication to this research and helping new and existing families living with Sanfilippo. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Kellie, and for the whole family for being here. It's a hard story to listen to, and it's hard for all of us in the room, but obviously hardest of all for the Campbells and all the families that are with us today. But that's why we're here. We're here to see if we can change that story. and fix it, as Kellie said. So my task now is just to really quickly take you through the roadmap, the global roadmap that we launched last year with the support of multiple Sanfilippo organisations, patient-led organisations around the globe. This is the roadmap that we together think that can lead us through to changing that story. So we're still, obviously, we're working on behind the scenes on the story, and I wanted to just quickly go over the roadmap on what we've done so far and what we've still got to do to really set the scene. Obviously, Kellie's story sets this, Mikayla's story sets the scene, and the roadmap sets the scene for everything that we're going to talk about today and tomorrow. So I wanted you to have this bit at the beginning so that as we're going through the symposium, we can keep the roadmap in mind and think about how we can be progressing things along this roadmap with the work that we are doing individually and collectively. So the roadmap, as you may be aware, has 3 key pillars, research pillars, and is underpinned by a set of enabling initiatives. The pillars are to stop the disease in its tracks, to treat the disease and tackle the underlying pathology that is going on, and in the here and now to manage the symptoms of the condition and support the families and improve quality of life as they go through those journeys. And as you will have noticed, the program for the symposium is themed around those roadmap pillars. So it's we're trying to keep those things in mind as we go through the conversations today. So in terms of stopping the disease at its root cause, as you're aware, there's many therapies that there's the gene therapies, the enzyme replacement therapies that are already in clinical trials. But we need to make sure that those get through to the end of the line, and we need to make sure that they get to the patients when they need it to have the maximum impact. So we're excited to have Karin Kassahn here to talk about her newborn screening pilot, and we're pleased to be able to support that project as a partner organisation. I can't take any credit for that project, but being able to collaborate with the researchers that are working on these new techniques for newborn screening is very exciting for us, and we hope to hear more about that shortly. We have also been working behind the scenes in the foundation in terms of thinking about what we need to do as a foundation, as an organisation, to start collecting the information, collecting data, so that we can build up our case for advocacy to, once we have newborn screening sort of tested and settled, and once we have those treatments, that they're already on the horizon, they're very close indeed, that we can get newborn screening up and on the list so that those treatments can be made available as soon as possible to babies as soon as they're diagnosed. So there's a piece of work that we have to do as a foundation there, and we'll collaborate with the whole community, with researchers and clinicians and the families to make sure we have that information ready and available to go. We're excited that the MRFF has funded several projects. Nick Smith here had a project funded about getting the genes into the brain more easily than some of the current techniques. So those projects are ongoing and happening. We're also exploring in terms of being able to expand the availability of treatments, expand the treatment windows. We're seeing what we can do with the Brain in a Dish platform to answer some of those questions about therapeutic windows. And one of the sort of themes of this is that there are some areas where there's been quite a lot of work done in terms of treatments for Sanfilippo type A and B, but attenuated forms of the disease have been neglected in terms of clinical trials and research more generally. There is research and treatments in progress for type C and D, but again, they're a little bit behind. So we were really pleased to be able to get some funding to collect cells from patients with attenuated disease so that we can include them in the research programs. and include them in those treatment development programs. And I know that Kim and Nick have also been busily collecting cells from patients with type B and C as well, to expand our ability to research across the whole spectrum of Sanfilippo. And in terms of being able to make those treatments available and understand how they're working, when they're working, etc., research into biomarkers and is also ongoing. And Jan Kaslin, who I hope will be here at some point over the course of these 2 days, is working on some research that we hope will lead to biomarkers as well. I'll talk a little bit, obviously that last point there about overcoming the challenges for clinical trials is a big one, and that really falls into the camp of the enabling initiatives. In terms of the treat pillar, again, exploring the Brain in a Dish platform. The Brain in a Dish platform is a flagship program. Obviously, it's run by the researchers here in Samry and Nick and Kim and Mark Hutchinson, but it was driven by the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation, and we're looking at all the possible ways we can use that platform to explore the pathology of the disease and understand how that pathology leads to symptoms and progression of the disease. We're funding projects looking at anti-inflammatories as well, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. So all of these things are in pieces looking at this bigger problem. Again, looking at using the omics technologies to really explore gene expression, to look at what's happening inside the cells and how it affects different cells differently. Again, funding projects independently to look at that, but also, again, using the Brain in a Dish platform to explore that. And one of the biggest challenges is sort of number 4 on this list here, is thinking about developing different ways to collaborate and different ways to fund research. And that's a big challenge, and something that we're thinking about and exploring, but it's going to take a lot more work. And I think one of the things I'd like to talk about and us to think about as we go through today is how we can work together to leverage some of those funding opportunities. Obviously, we're a small foundation with limited resources, so how do we think bigger and beyond the foundation to be able to fund some of this work that needs to be done? When it comes to managing the symptoms and quality of life, our colleagues at Cure Sanfilippo Foundation have done some amazing work on this, looking at the preferences and concerns of families in relation to what they expect and hope for out of treatments and therapies. And I think in terms of harnessing the wealth of families' lived experience and clinical experience, I really think that this symposium and having families at this symposium and other forums where we can bring everybody together is a really powerful way that we can start those conversations and say, how can we address some of the concerns of families in terms of symptoms and living with this condition? So let's bear that in mind as we go through the conversations and listen to each other today and tomorrow. In terms of supporting clinicians and families to manage the disease as best they can, we are really proud to have worked with the Cure Sanfilippo Foundation and clinicians around the world to develop the consensus guidelines for Sanfilippo clinical care. We have worked as hard as we can to disseminate those as wide as possible so that as many doctors get to see that information, so that when they do meet a patient with Sanfilippo syndrome, they immediately know how to care for that child and that family and make sure that they get the best care right from the start. We are also working with Cure Sanfilippo Foundation to convert that clinical document, which is a big, dense document. I know, Teresa, you've had a really good look through it, and we've talked about that. It would really benefit from having a condensed lay version so that families can have that quick reference. They know what to ask their clinicians. They know what support to look for. So we are working on that, and we hope to get that done later this year. We've funded some research in terms of symptom management, but I think there's a lot more that can be done in this area, and we've been having some great conversations with researchers who work in the space of pain and in sleep, and we're going to hear from Jasneek later today about sleep as well. So we're making inroads, but there's a lot more that we can be doing there. And in terms of the enabling initiatives, the way that we can work together, bring people together and bring data and information together. We are making progress in this area as well. As some of you may know, we're aware we did some advocacy in terms of working with regulatory bodies. This is a big area that our colleagues in the US are working on in terms of helping the FDA to understand how they can help us better to get these therapies, the ones that are in clinical trials, quickly through and more available. So, you know, opening up these pathways for the treatments that are coming on the horizon now will mean that everything else can flow, and it will stimulate and de-risk the whole field so that we can get more treatments coming through. But there's a lot of work to be done in that area. Trying to just simply raise awareness so that clinicians and families and global organisations know where to go, where to work together, where families point families in the right direction, so that as soon as they're diagnosed, they can find like-minded people and work with clinicians and researchers. And one of the things that we have been quietly working on behind the scenes and hope to launch more formally soon is an alliance of Sanfilippo patient organisations around the world. And one of the things that we, as a group of patient organisations, have been focusing on is the potential for a Sanfilippo-specific patient registry, so that we can collect data on families. We know where families are. We can make sure that individuals are what I would call clinical trial ready, so that as soon as a clinical trial is available, those families are available, there's data collected on them, but also pooling that data so that we can enhance the research that is being done. So that's something that we are still working away on, and it's going to take a while, take a lot of effort, but really interested to hear people's thoughts on what we can do with that as well. And our colleagues at Cure Sanfilippo Foundation have also kicked off an initiative in terms of sharing data. So clinical trial data and natural history data that has been collected to date. There's a huge amount of data out there, but it's all in different silos. And the power of being able to bring that data together is going to be amazing. So watch this space on that one as well. So as we go through today, wanted to try and plant some seeds in your mind in terms of the questions that we might talk about later on this afternoon, the questions that we all need to be thinking about as a collective community. That where are the gaps in the research, and how can we position ourselves to fill those gaps? We can't do everything, but as an Australian community in particular, what are the strengths that we have to either fill those gaps, or what we need to capitalise on and accelerate progress in the things that we collectively are good at? And what are the opportunities, and how do we position ourselves as a group of researchers and clinicians and families to seek out those other funding opportunities and those other ways of working together? And who else, excuse me, who else should we be working with so that we can move things along this pathway as quickly as possible? So I'll leave those questions to percolate through your brains, and we will move on and get stuck into the science and get stuck into the work that we're here to do.
Thanks indeed to Lisa and the Sanfilippo team for inviting me to speak today, and I'm truly pleased to be here at this really important meeting and a nexus for all of us amongst families and scientists and clinicians. And I think it's a truly inspiring place to be, thinking about the challenges that we face in this world of Sanfilippo. And when I was speaking to Lisa about this, and apologies, I have a tendency to move around, so if you can't hear me, just give me a yell and I'll come back to the microphone. I was speaking to Lisa about how we might present some of the challenges for Sanfilippo, and one of the tasks that we thought would be a good way to do that, and to begin with, would be to look at some of the challenges faced when we design a therapy or attempt to design a therapy for neurodegenerative disease and Sanfilippo, and indeed for families along the journey that they face. And I'm clearly not going to be able to present that challenge and that journey anywhere near as well as we've just heard from Kellie and family, and thank you for that. But I'd like to try and put some context around this, and again pose some questions for us all as we move through the next day and a half to consider. I'll skip over that, but that's just the obligatory stuff. This also is a slide that, you know, is the ubiquitous Sanfilippo slide. All of us here are familiar with Sanfilippo, so I don't need to spend too much time on this, but we all know that Sanfilippo is a progressive neurodegenerative disease of which there are 4 biochemical subtypes. It's a rare disease, but it's not clearly rare enough because we are challenged by this, and families are challenged by this every day across, within Australia and across the world. But I want to draw your attention away from the biochemistry, which we'll talk about later, and the pathology, and look at the clinical progress that children and families face with Sanfilippo, and touch upon that. I'm just going to, apologies, I'm having some troubles here. Children with Sanfilippo commence life like all other children with no evidence of disease, no evidence of symptoms. But as we've seen and as we've heard from Kellie, and as we'll hear across the course of the next day and a bit, children begin to develop profound symptoms from early in life. And that varies across the different subtypes of Sanfilippo, and it varies across the various forms of disease. And we've heard about typical disease, which is, of course, the more common forms of Sanfilippo, and indeed more attenuated disease. So children who are developing at a slower trajectory than other forms of Sanfilippo syndrome, and we'll come back to that. But as you can see here, children are developing normally, but sadly, as they age and as they grow, that development starts to attenuate, starts to slow, and indeed those children begin to lose skills and progressively lose skills, developing dementia, loss of neurocognitive skills, loss of neuromotor function, and sadly lead to a premature death with, in typical forms of disease, the vast majority of children by late adolescence. So we've heard the term the diagnostic journey or the diagnostic odyssey, and I want to unpack that a little bit because this is really critical for us to all think about. And we heard this from Kellie this morning, I think in a very telling way. Up to 70% of children, in fact the majority of children with Sanfilippo, actually manifest symptoms before 12 months of age. Early symptoms, they're non-specific, irritable babies, sleep disturbances, the veritable colic that all of us who work in paediatrics and have worked in general paediatrics meet babies with these sorts of symptoms on a daily basis. What does it mean? It's non-specific most of the time. But the age that these children receive their diagnosis still, to this day, is delayed, up to 6 years for some children. This is data looking at the typical form of disease, the more rapidly progressive forms of disease. And that timeline expands out even further, significantly further for children and families who are manifesting attenuated forms of disease with a later manifestation of symptoms. And indeed, even today, with the technologies that we have, the biochemical diagnostic technologies and molecular diagnostic technologies, that time to diagnosis and to receive an answer for your child has largely remained unchanged over the past 3 decades. So to look at this a little bit further, and this slide I think would be a very familiar journey to many of the families here and the clinicians who work with children with Sanfilippo syndrome. Why does this diagnostic delay occur? We've got the technology, we've got the expertise, we've got the laboratory teams here that can do these tests in a very short period of time. So why are families waiting 5-6 years to get a diagnosis in many cases? Well, there are a number of hurdles and factors that play into this, and these are some of the challenges that we face in the clinical management of children with neurodegenerative disease and Sanfilippo syndrome in particular that we need to look at and try and overcome. There's a clear lack of awareness about these diseases, and that lack of awareness is amongst the wider health professions and non-health professionals, early childhood educationalists, childcare, child development nurses and systems, GPs, paediatricians, and indeed subspecialist paediatricians. And this is critical to any diagnosis. On top of that, there's a societal lack of awareness of these diseases. I don't know, how many families I hear who tell me that the neighbour over the back fence says, well, your child can't have dementia, they can't be degenerating because that doesn't occur. And families are then confronted with having to explain their circumstance and explain their child's circumstance. But with greater societal awareness, we can increase the support and understanding and channel children to access diagnoses. There's clinical uncertainty. We've talked about this. These symptoms are often very diverse and protean. And for clinicians and families who are faced with this, the first question in their mind is this a child who is losing skills? Or are they a child who's just slowing down a bit, a child who's not quite as developing as rapidly as their peers at kindy and childcare? Or is this a child who has a disease that we would consider static, a neurodevelopmental disease, and one that is perhaps better understood within the community? Most people understand about autism and cerebral palsy and these other conditions that are well understood amongst the lay population. But they also give an impression that these children have challenges, but not challenges that are progressing and degenerating. These are the Sanfilippo mimics. There's also a lack of knowledge of diagnostic pathways, and I think we heard from Kellie's story this morning how David Ketteridge, and I think, Kellie, you described David beautifully, and he would not at all be unhappy to be described in that way. That until David entered the room, there was an uncertainty about how one investigated Mikayla, how one helped the family find an answer from those clinicians, and how to access those tests. And thankfully, David was able, in Mikayla's circumstance, to help there. And at times also, we have to recognise within the clinical community at least that there can be a reluctance to diagnose such a challenging disorder. Perhaps not intentional, perhaps not overt, but there is a challenge in taking this journey and walking this journey with parents, and we need to overcome that amongst the clinicians. We need to understand that this may be confronting for us, but it's not a patch on what parents and families are experiencing. Children deserve an answer, and this suggestion that we need to either ignore or placate the parent who is fussing about their child, this is an area that sadly, unfortunately, still occurs, though thankfully increasingly less so. But also this belief that nothing can be done, and symposiums like this and the work that's been done for Sanfilippo, I hope, are challenging that, and certainly the therapies that are developing, we hope, will soon change that so that statement is no longer accurate for children and families with Sanfilippo syndrome. So why does it matter? Well, this is a confronting statement, but we all know here time is brain. This is a coarse way of recognising that for neurodegenerative disease, as we lose neurological function and capacity, what we're really demonstrating here is a pathological process that is resulting in a lack of brain function, neuronal and supporting cells, which translates then to the clinical outcomes and loss of function and loss of skills that we see in children. There's multiple mechanisms to this. We're only starting to unpack these and understand them, and we're going to talk about those in some detail across the course of the day. But we need to recognise that the challenge for these disorders is impacting them in a positive way at an early enough time that we can make a real difference to children and with their outcomes. Time is quality. Well, what do I mean by this? Obviously, the ability for an early diagnosis and providing an early diagnosis to children and families means that we can put the appropriate supports around them. We can help access those supports. We can help structure supports within the community, whether that's through
disability supports, NDIS, clinical supports, educational supports, and all of the things that are important to help manage and help families manage their children, so that they're not doing it on their own. And this is an area that we absolutely need to consider, and where there is a lot of work to be done, and foundations like Sanfilippo Children's are very much cognizant of this and progressing this. And also, of course, time being quality allows us that when we have a diagnosis for children with of Sanfilippo syndrome, we can think about those supportive and symptomatic management approaches. And Lisa gave some comment towards that, and the work that needs to be done there, and the challenges we have, because we can certainly do it better. And time is also precious, and I think this goes without saying. Kellie made the point far better than I can, that we have a challenge here, and the clock is ticking. So why do we want a timely diagnosis? To belabor the point a little bit further, we want to minimise the impact on patients and families. This is not just we can't do anything to minimise the impact of the diagnosis, but that diagnosis is even more challenging when it comes after months and years of invasive tests and meeting specialists and other physicians and different health services that throw their hands up in the air and say, well, we're not sure, and we're going to do another test and another test, and we'll hopefully get an answer. So that's a huge burden on families who are already dealing with a child where their diagnosis is uncertain, where their symptoms are increasing, and where the distress is overwhelming. But a timely diagnosis therefore empowers families. It provides a reassurance, albeit a very confronting diagnosis. Having an answer can be a helpful thing. It can allow us to define our goals of care. It can allow us to have some understanding of what we're dealing with, and to know that we're being heard, that their children are being heard, and that we can start to plan and inform around what that family and those children need, and to hear from them what they need in that context. We heard that this also facilitates access to clinical trials, and a timely diagnosis is critical to clinical trials for these degenerative diseases, where we have a window of opportunity to come to. It's not the most important consideration, but a timely diagnosis is also important for our management of the wider community of children with neurodegenerative disease. And it allows us to, instead of spending dollars on unnecessary tests and things that aren't helping those children, to redirect those funds to where they're really needed. But of course, the most important reason for a timely diagnosis is to provide a platform for successful outcomes with disease-modifying therapy. So when we look at therapies for neurodegenerative disease and Sanfilippo syndrome, I'm taking a broad brush approach here. Obviously, the aspirational goal for us is to be able to reverse neurodegeneration, to undo what's happened with the disease. And we all know here today that that's a difficult challenge. It's something that is not a challenge that we're going to overcome quickly. But increasingly, we are looking at how we can halt neurodegeneration. This is the realistic goal, and the one that with encouragement and with some of the therapies that we're seeing provides us great encouragement now and in the not too distant future for children with this disease. What do we require, obviously, to develop a successful therapy? Well, we need to understand the pathology, and we're going to hear more about that today. We need an effective therapy or strategy to intervene against that pathology. That's pretty obvious. But we also need to be able to get that therapy from the lab, from the bench side, from the mouse to the child and at the bedside. And there are challenges there. We need to look at therapies that have a clinical magnitude of benefit. And this is a very common occurrence for those of us working in this field, where we find something that has a biological effect. It raises our hopes in the laboratory, but doesn't necessarily translate to a clinical benefit. An acceptable safety profile is obviously understood. And we need a timely intervention. We need to understand when we can give these therapies. What is the therapeutic window? What do we mean by that? Well, there are lots of therapies that are in development and have been developed and are promising in their development that if we give them at the end stage of disease, are going to sadly have very little impact on that disease for children. This is intuitive. So we need to understand where those therapies will benefit and when can we give them to provide the utmost and optimum benefit. And that's obviously specific to Sanfilippo, but also specific to the individual therapies. And indeed, there are a number of therapies that one might consider in conjunction, synergistically together and in combination, that may change that therapeutic window and allow us to treat children later. And I want to give you an example of this very briefly. This is data that we've presented publicly previously, and I think many people in this room will be familiar. But one therapy that highlights this therapeutic window and the importance of the therapeutic window in Sanfilippo syndrome is a clinical trial that was initially commenced by Abiona and has now been taken over by Ultragenics with a new rebadged name. But this is a trial of AAV-directed gene transfer therapy for Sanfilippo syndrome type A, previously known as the ABO 102 study. And to give people a brief overview, this looked at dosing children, is looking at dosing children with gene therapy and AAV-based gene vector to deliver the gene SGSH to the nervous system via systemic delivery, and following those children through for a period of years. And we're now indeed out to the long-term follow-up of that study for children who were dosed some as long ago as 2017. Take a step back. This is cumulative data from a number of natural history studies for type A, Sanfilippo MPS 3A. And you can see here what we've seen on previous slides and what we all understand about this disease. Children start life with development within a normal trajectory. Their developmental quotient, which is a measure of their neurocognitive function and abilities with multiple factors. They start on a normal trajectory, but over time, and particularly around 2 years plus, start to slow their development and lose skills, sadly plateauing and progressing to a premature death. Children who have been dosed with this product, and again, this is slightly dated data, but I want to use it to make the point because we're still following these children through with this study. What we found as we started to dose children who initially were enrolled in this study from anywhere from 6 months of age through to 18 years of age, or at least that was the induction criteria, it soon became apparent, and I want you to look at the top slide in the corner of the screen here. It soon became apparent that children who received this therapy after around about 30 months of age or thereabouts were unfortunately demonstrating a very similar development trajectory to children who had received no therapy at all, to the natural history and progress of the disease. But children who received that therapy before 30 months of age, or indeed before 24 months of age, have shown a trajectory aligned with that we might expect in the normal population, or nearer to a normal developmental trajectory. So this provides us with, first and foremost, great encouragement about this therapy, and it's most exciting, and we are really looking at how these children progress, and this is a therapy that everyone in this room will be aware of. There are a number of other gene therapies that have a similar approach that are also showing this very encouraging progress and outcomes, but it's early days and we recognise that. But to bring you back today and to make the point that what this shows us is that this therapy has a therapeutic window. It has a timing where we need to which we need to recognise if we're going to have success from these therapies. And that is predicated on identifying these children early and providing this therapy at a point where it will actually benefit them. And you can think back to these children who have a timeline of 5-6 years to diagnosis. They already miss this therapeutic window. They miss it by a long way. Indeed, the children who were dosed early in this study, the vast majority of them were recruited because we knew they had Sanfilippo because of other children within the family. They were diagnosed at birth because of that recognition within their family, which enabled them to get access to this trial and enabled them to get access to therapy at a time point that fit within the therapeutic window and to benefit from those outcomes. So what do we need to do to widen this window? How do we ensure that these sorts of therapies can benefit more children? Well, one way, of course, is to develop better therapies and validate those therapies that can be given at later points of the disease journey. That's a real challenge. It's one that the people in this room are, hands to the grindstone, heads to the grindstone, trying to achieve. But that is a challenge. What can we do right now? What can we start to do with our health services and systems now? How can we help widen this window? Well, we can detect these diseases earlier, and so we can intervene earlier. How do we do that? Well, we need to improve awareness. We've discussed that, and we need to increase the index of suspicion. So when a parent comes to you and says, look, my child has these symptoms, I'm concerned, they're going backwards, they're just not the same as the other children. We actually know, our clinicians know how to channel those families to the David Kettridges, how to understand these pathways to a diagnosis and how to access them. And they don't have to know Sanfilippo backwards. They just have to know that these features may be representative of Sanfilippo or other neurodegenerative conditions, and help these families access the appropriate diagnostic pathways. So we need to educate our clinical workforce, and indeed our non-clinical workforce, our educationalists and so forth, who often are amongst the first people with parents to pick these symptoms up. And we can do that by looking at clinical assessment tools, and Lisa has already mentioned the Sanfilippo consensus guidelines, which go a long way to helping specialist clinicians and wider clinical colleagues to understand Sanfilippo and how to care for it, but also through recognition of early symptoms. And this is a piece of work from Maria Escolar and colleagues across the world, but largely US-based, again with Cure Sanfilippo supporting this, to look at the early symptoms, these non-specific features for Sanfilippo, to help clinicians who are not familiar with this disease understand when they should be thinking about Sanfilippo syndrome. And we heard again the story from Kellie with Mikayla having colic and some of these non-specific symptoms. And if her physician had this tool perhaps to provide this scoring and some understanding and recognition of Sanfilippo, then perhaps their journey may have been shorter. And of course, we can also look at how we develop, and critically how we look at screening and newborn screening. We're going to hear from Karin about this very shortly. This is the key really to identifying children with Sanfilippo. This is where we're headed in contemporary clinical practice. But Sanfilippo syndrome does not exist on any of the Australian and indeed globally newborn screening panels as we stand here today. A case needs to be made for it, and I think there's a very strong case for that, and it's something that is being prosecuted globally with our colleagues in the US, Cure Sanfilippo and colleagues, and indeed, most encouragingly, Sanfilippo has been included in the Screen Plus US newborn screening study, which is a research study to look at making a case for inclusion in the unified screening program in the US. And indeed, the Australian group that looks federally at this inclusions in the newborn screening is considering their panel regularly. But one of the difficulties we have is that these programs are state-based. So whilst the federal government provides advice on conditions that should be included in these programs, it's a state-based endeavour, and that in itself has limitations. So I'm going to stop there, and I think what I've done is probably raise more questions than I've given answers, but I'm hoping that as we move through the course of the day, we have time to discuss these and to consider how we can challenge ourselves to overcome these hurdles, and I look forward to discussing that with you all today.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Kim, for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. So as Kim alluded to, I'm a genomic scientist. I'm not an expert in Sanfilippo, but what I'd like to do is introduce our research program in newborn screening and how it may be relevant to Sanfilippo and improving that diagnostic, our ability to detect earlier. So this is our study team. It's co-led by myself and Enzo Ranieri. We have investigators from SA Pathology, Women's and Children's, the University of Adelaide, and also external. And I'd just like to acknowledge Lucy Anastasi, our new project manager, Carol Sue are here today, and also Emily Mars and Kualama joining online. And of course, Nick is here. You've just heard him present, and he's very much part of this project as well. And Drago Bratkovic, who you would also, some of you would know. And so the way I have come to newborn screening is through my interest in pediatric and reproductive health. And my team had the opportunity to be involved in this national program, the Acute Care Genomic Study, to help diagnose children in intensive care units. So these are children who present with severe disorder, severe disease, and we were looking at trying to help the diagnostic journey and cut that odyssey down. And we did this by offering trio whole genome sequencing, and the results were available in 3 days. And in an intensive care setting, that is obviously critical. And importantly, amongst the almost 300 children, we made 150 diagnoses, which is almost a 50% diagnostic yield. And so it's highly effective. But as rare disease goes, it's a lot of individual diagnosis in a whole range of disorders. And you can see some of those examples here. I don't expect you to be familiar, but I just wanted to press a point that, you know, rare disease is a complex, a complex group to diagnose. And so the trio genome was important in this setting. But what if we could detect some of these conditions at birth, before these children become symptomatic, before they become really ill and present in these settings? And so this is how my personal journey, how I came to be interested in genomic newborn screening. So this is the idea that we would bring some of these technologies to this context. So newborn screening, you wouldn't be familiar with the heel prick that is given to babies near the first day or two of after birth. And that's a very successful public health program. It has a huge uptake, 98% of families participate. But of course, there's many conditions like Sanfilippo that are currently not screened for. In fact, it's detecting approximately 28 conditions. So it's effective, but limited in what it is targeting. And as Nick has so nicely demonstrated, diagnosis at birth and early intervention is the best chance to have good outcomes. And so this is where I guess the Australian government has also asked, what can genomics and other new technologies offer in this space? How well would they work? How do you integrate genomics into a newborn screening program? Do you do it at the start as a first tier on everyone? That's a huge cost. Do you have it as a second tier? How do you actually bring this together with the standard program? And is it acceptable to the population? Do people want their genome sequenced? We're talking about the whole population. So it's a lot of big questions. So the call for research was out, and I've had chats with Lisa Melton, who kindly gave me more context around Sanfilippo and the current context, the outline of potential treatment approaches that also Nick touched on, the fact that these conditions are very rare, and some of the variants can, from a genetic point of view, they can be difficult to interpret if you were to see them at birth. And the treatments need to be initiated early to have an effect, but also that some clinical trials are currently closed. There's others that are opening up. So it's still an evolving space. And the opportunity, of course, is what we're here is to enable early detection and then get children into the clinical trial at a time point that is before that loss of brain function, and to really have that impact on rescuing that function. So our research then is very much complementary to the existing newborn screening. It's not a replacement. This is research. This is what we are proposing to do. So we've been successful in receiving this funding from the MRFF. It's a $3 million 3-year project, and it's looking across rare disease across a full spectrum. And so I will talk a little bit in detail, give you a bit more context about the metabolomic and the whole genome sequencing that we're proposing. So that's how it's integrated in multi-omics. So we're using 2 different tools to try and deliver earlier diagnosis. And I guess what these whole programs are trying to do is trying to get away from developing one newborn screening test for each new disorder, because that is a lot of disorders and a lot of new test development. So we're looking, or researchers in this sort of space are looking at ways to, in bulk, if you like, detect lots of different conditions with the one new genomic approach. So so at the moment, this is where we're at right now, is we are validating this metabolomic approach to see whether we would be able to pick up known cases by them having a different metabolic profile than a background population. And so it's maybe a little bit faint to see, but the idea here is, let me see, yeah. No, I can't point, that's, no, that's okay. We're looking to cluster the, so we measure lots of metabolites across from the dry blood spot samples, and we cluster, and most of the population would circle like the green dots here, but we're looking for profiles that are outlying, that are different in some way. At that point, we do not know why. And so that's what we're doing. We're pulling out cards that we have ethics for from the archive. They're punched. So we're extracting a little bit of that dry blood spot sample. We're putting it on a mass spec instrument, a time-of-flight machine. And so far we have looked at the effect of different years on how well can we detect profiles in these stored cards. Obviously, going forward, we will have fresh cards, but we need to work out at the moment what type of conditions can we detect using this approach. What is the sensitivity? How many do we miss when we know we should have detected them? And how many do we call falsely as having an outlying profile when in fact they do not have a genetic diagnosis? So that's the work being done by Kwa and Emily and their colleagues at the Women's and Children as we speak. At the moment, in the ethics cohort that, or in the cohort that we have ethics for, we do not have an MPS III patient, but we are working on expanding that and finding ways to include retrospect, so patients with known disease, to see whether this approach would pick up these. And then, of course, the main part of our study is to enroll patients prospectively. So this will happen hopefully early in next year, that we're looking to enroll patients in this multi-omic approach, and they will then receive the metabolic profiling that I've just shown you. And if it all goes smoothly and perfectly, we would predict that we can detect up to 110 babies across various rare diseases in the study cohort. But we don't know how effective this approach will be. So this is one of the research questions we're asking. What will be the pickup? And does it work similarly well at different disease groups? Does it work at scale? Like, can we actually deliver that effectively? Do we need to repeat it a lot? What are the technical challenges? Now, patients that have an outlying metabolic profile will then be offered whole genome sequencing to determine if there is a genetic disorder underlying, because by just having this feature sort of in the profile, we do not know yet what the specific disorder is. So this is why we need to then do follow-up genetic testing. This is an opt-in, so there will be extensive genetic counselling offered to these families, and it will be their choice whether to participate. Of course, this is not part of standard newborn screening. This is very much a research study, and as such is offered in that context as an opt-in. And the reporting will be limited to genes that are relevant in a newborn screening context. So treatable early onset disorders, approximately 500 genes, or disorder where there is an early intervention. And we want to see, what are the number and types of confirmed diagnoses we can establish. But of course, as I've shown you, I've come from this acute care background. Sometimes children are born unwell, or they have other clinical features that we know put them at risk of having a genetic disorder. So we want to fast track those children. So instead of them going through the standard diagnostic route, they will be also offered whole genome sequencing straight away, independent of the results of the metabolomic approach. And so that's sort of a 3-tier approach, I guess, we're taking here. Now, Drago presented on sort of the pathway for current diagnosis of Sanfilippo last year, and he shared kindly his slides with me. And so I guess what we are trying to see is, does metabolomic profiling have some role in the as sort of a newborn screening test there? And then instead of doing genetic analysis using traditional approaches, we would do the whole genome sequencing. So this is where I see this relate to the current diagnostic workup. And I guess our research will assess this along with other disorders. Our project also has a health implementation and economic impact study, because at the end it's important that this is effective, it has clinical utility, but it's also cost effective if this is to be considered in a public health setting. And so we're working with our colleagues, Tracy Melton and her group at the University of Adelaide, to do this health technology evaluation. We want to ask, what difference did the early diagnosis make to clinical outcomes? How well did the process work, and was it acceptable to the families, to health professionals, the midwives who take the dry blood spot samples? So very briefly, we hope that using this approach, we will detect more children, and we hope that that would then lead to better health outcomes compared to standard of care, where that diagnosis may be delayed. We will generate data on cost effectiveness and feasibility of this model, and hopefully we have a better understanding of the risks, the limitations and the benefits of genomic newborn screening, and a better understanding of how families and the public feel about this as they have to participate in the consent process, and we will receive feedback on these types of concerns people will raise. But there's a lot of challenges and unknowns. So technical, will the metabolomic approach be effective as a first-tier screen? Can we even interpret the variants to predict disease? Not all variants are pathogenic. And we need to balance that sensitivity to screen with our need to recall or do more testing. And then from an ethical and logistical point of view, how do we best communicate this study with families, and how do we best consent them? It is a complex, different, I guess, approach to have genomes sequenced at birth. It does need special consideration. How do we manage then risk perception, privacy concerns, trust, and the autonomy of the child when we are doing this? And how do we implement this program safely and equitably on a large scale? So for those questions, we are looking to perform stakeholder engagement activities to get in different interest groups and opinions and input into how we make patient information materials, how we consent, and the reporting for after the testing. Now, I don't know, in terms of time, should I hurry along a little bit, Kim? A couple more minutes. So as Nick already touched on, there's a lot of discussion about what conditions are in and out of scope of genomic newborn screening, and we're seeking input in that respect. We're collaborating nationally and internationally. And so here you can see some of the groups in the world, and also nationally we have a group, GenScan, that is looking to be a collaborative forum, but also the key engagement body for bringing genomic newborn screening into Australia. And so when you look at the that example that I've given at the start, actually, of those conditions that we picked up, those 6 conditions in the acute care study, the first 2 would actually fit that sort of standard model, not the current consensus on what should be in a newborn screening program. The ones on the right do not, usually because there is either no therapy, or the disease is too difficult to predict. And so there's an active, I guess, collaborative work being done at the moment to review conditions and work where to draw the boundaries. And if you think about where genomics may touch across different life stages, we've talked today about newborn screening, where the paradigm in the community today is treatable or intervention. And this is where I think as a group we can have input as well. But it's really targeted at these early onset conditions. That's different from the reproductive carrier screening, where the focus is on severe conditions, independent on what therapies are available or not, because that is a test in parents prior to pregnancy. And so you can see there's different avenues and different focus of what these different programs are, I guess, wanting to do. I'm very involved in diagnostic testing and prenatal testing, and that has, again, a different context of, and I think we can tap into all of these areas to improve, I guess, diagnosis and outcomes. So early detection is important. It gives access to clinical trials and an opportunity for intervention, treatment, prevention, and monitoring. So the NewbornsInSA, we're using that dual approach with the metabolomic and genome sequencing, but it's different to doing diagnostic testing, which sometimes get mixed up, but that's newborn testing or diagnostic testing. Here we are doing it in an asymptomatic infant, and we're predicting, and we need to be sure that that is safe and that we know when we give back a result to family that that's accurate. So we do need to balance that desire to screen for many conditions with the anxiety when we say, oh, we need to do further work, we found something, but we need to work out more. And also what people, the general public, what people, what families want and expect from screening. So I'll leave here, and this is an email. If you like to participate in some of our stakeholder engagement activities, please email us your expression of interest. And thank you for listening, and thank you.
Right, thank you very much for that introduction, Cedric. And thank you to the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation for inviting me to speak today. So I'm really looking forward to presenting some of the story that's emerging from the first year of my fellowship. Okay. Alzheimer's disease and Sanfilippo on face value seem like pretty distinct disorders, but it's becoming increasingly clear that this is not the case. There are similarities, both in the clinical characteristics as well as at the cellular level in the brain. But perhaps one of the most important similarities is that there is no cure for either of these diseases. So recently there was this really beautiful paper that was published back in 2019 by Yambria and colleagues that was describing a cellular mechanism that links some of the shared pathologies between Alzheimer's and Sanfilippo. They were looking at the role of lysosomal acidification in maintaining iron homeostasis. So what they showed is that it's the acidic nature of the lysosome that is required for the biologically inactive ferric form of iron, Fe3+, shown up in blue, to be converted to the biologically active Fe2+, the ferrous form of iron. And it's this ferrous form of iron which goes on to be used by the cell, for example, generating energy in mitochondria. So when the lysosome fails to be properly acidified, ferric iron is stuck in the lysosome. It can't be converted to the ferrous form. This leads to an intracellular iron deficiency and subsequently mitochondrial dysfunction and inflammation.
But perhaps one of the most beautiful results of this paper was that they showed that iron supplementation rescued a whole bunch of these different phenotypes, both in vitro and in vivo. And one of the in vivo phenotypes that they rescued was a behavioural phenotype in their mice, and it was simply due to dietary iron supplementation. So this result quite excited us because we see lysosomal acidification defects across several adult and childhood onset degenerative diseases, not just neurodegenerative. In Alzheimer's disease, we see it in familial models, so due to presenilin 1 mutations and some APP models, as well as in ApoE4 astrocytes. So ApoE4 is the strongest genetic risk factor for the late onset sporadic form of Alzheimer's disease. We also see it in Parkinson's and related diseases. So we see it due to the LRRK2 G29S mutation, which is the most common genetic variant found in Parkinson's disease. We see it in a juvenile onset form of Parkinson's, in Gaucher's disease. Now we're into the lysosomal storage disorders. So we see it in mucolipidosis type 2, in the NCLs, and importantly, we also see it in MPS type 1. But whether this is happening in Sanfilippo, we don't really know yet. But what we do know for Sanfilippo is we do see evidence supporting iron dyshomeostasis. So this is some evidence for Sanfilippo type B, where we see increased total iron levels in the brain of a mouse model. And there's also an in vivo brain imaging study on a patient with Sanfilippo type B, which was indicative of iron deposition in their brain. But the broader role of iron homeostasis in Sanfilippo isn't fully understood. And so this leads me to one of the questions I'm addressing during my fellowship. Is impaired lysosomal acidification leading to intracellular iron dyshomeostasis a common disease mechanism between Sanfilippo and Alzheimer's disease? And addressing this question is really important because if it is a shared disease mechanism, we have some therapeutic ideas that we want to test to see if we can see if it can rescue the phenotypes. And this could eventually lead to therapies, which could have benefit for people living with either disease. Oops, sorry. And I'll be exploring this question during my fellowship using a range of different disease models, but at the moment I'm primarily focused on using my zebrafish models. So on the Alzheimer's disease side, we've already got some evidence supporting that this disease mechanism is happening in our zebrafish. So I'm just going to take you through some of the results on the Alzheimer's disease side. Back in 2021, we published some work which was led by now Dr. Yang Dong, and we performed a transcriptome analysis of one of our zebrafish models of familial Alzheimer's disease. And we performed this analysis when these larvae fish were 7 days old. And 7 days old is quite young for zebrafish, and so when we're looking at this age, we're looking at the very earliest changes which would eventually lead to Alzheimer's many decades in the future. So this was the study design for this experiment. We analysed 6 pools of larvae, 6 mutant genotypes for the presenilin mutation and 6 wild-type pools, and each individual pool consisted of 40 larvae. We also incorporated this really nice paired study design so that we could reduce the genetic variation between the pools and would increase our power, statistical power to detect differentially expressed genes. I'm just going to skip forward to the gene ontology analysis in this paper. This network diagram is a little bit complicated, but what I just wanted to highlight here is that the gene ontology term for iron transport was significantly enriched in the DE genes. And it was driven by the transferrin receptor, TFA, transferrin and the transferrin receptor, and also a couple of the ferritin genes. So this supports that iron dyshomeostasis may already be occurring at this very young age in our zebrafish models. We also looked at that same mutation, but in 6-month-old young adult zebrafish brains. So at 6 months old, zebrafish are quite recently sexually mature, and so we believe this is equivalent to about early adulthood in humans. So these are still very early changes that are underlying Alzheimer's disease. At this age, we found that the DE genes were enriched in gene ontology terms that implicate lysosomal acidification. And So they're mostly incorporating the VATPase complex, that proton pump that pumps in the hydrogen ions that is responsible for acidifying the lysosome. So we can detect transcriptome level changes that support that impaired lysosomal acidification and ion dyshomeostasis can occur in our zebrafish models. But does this occur in our Sanfilippo zebrafish models? Which leads me to the first question I want to address during my fellowship. Can we detect transcriptome similarities between Sanfilippo and familial Alzheimer's disease in young zebrafish larvae? So to address this question, I wanted to compare wild-type zebrafish to our Sanfilippo models to our Alzheimer's disease model, all within a single family. And this is possible using zebrafish. We can in-cross fish with the appropriate genotypes to generate a very large family of sibling fish. And this is one of the largest strengths of using zebrafish as a model organism. The experimental family are all siblings, so they're all genetically similar. And they're all raised in a nice big petri dish together, so that it's in an identical environment. And, oh goddamn, sorry, identical environment. Yeah. So it's this reduction of genetic and environmental noise that allows us to detect very subtle differences due to our mutation of interest. So within this family, there are 6 possible combinations of mutant genotypes, and I've just highlighted the 3 here, which are the genotypes of interest, each representing about 1/8 of the entire family. But while this allowed, because the family is so big, I obtained and sequenced an N of 8 individual larvae per genotype. This is important to note here that in this experiment, I analysed individual larvae rather than the pools that we did last time, as the analysis of individuals is always preferred. So here are the results of my differential gene expression analysis. Unfortunately, I didn't detect any differentially expressed genes in the Alzheimer's disease mutant, likely because I was underpowered to detect any DE genes using the analysis of individuals. And a quick post hoc power calculation on this data set confirmed this. But I did detect some DE genes in the Sanfilippo mutant, and these are the gene ontology terms that were significantly overrepresented in the Sanfilippo fish. There's a fair few of them, but the one I'd like to highlight today are these geoterms that implicate that lysosomal acidification defects may be occurring in these larvae. So I also did another type of gene set enrichment analysis testing, this time on the KEGG pathways. And this method is slightly different than the result I showed you previously, as it doesn't rely on predefining differentially expressed genes. Rather, it looks at the pathway as a whole and determines whether there's some coordinated changes to gene expression. Essentially, it's really good at pulling out really subtle signals in the data, such as those that would be happening in the Alzheimer's disease mutant. So this heat map is summarising that result. The statistical significance is coloured, with the brighter, more yellow-looking colours are more statistically significant. And I managed to detect one significantly altered gene set in both mutants, the extracellular matrix receptor interaction. Perhaps this isn't surprising for Sanfilippo, as there's lots of glycosaminoglycans in the ECM, but it was quite surprising for our Alzheimer's disease mutant, as the role of the ECM is not fully appreciated in Alzheimer's disease. So I looked a little bit closer at whether this particular pathway was altered in the same way. So this is the KEGG diagram for the ECM receptor interaction gene set, and it's overlaid with a heat map, with the left-hand side showing Alzheimer's disease fold changes, and the right-hand side of each cell shows the Sanfilippo fold change. It's a little bit complicated, but what I'd like to point out is that the boxes that popped up in blue are the collagen genes, which seem to be similarly implicated in both mutants, and the beta-connectin genes, which seem to be also similarly altered. So this is quite an interesting and intriguing result, and I'm super keen to follow this up in the near future with some histology methods. Looking at you, Helen. So that was the larvae. I also wanted to repeat the experiment in adult brain, where we know that we have sufficient power to detect DE genes in the Alzheimer's disease mutant. So it was the same study design as the larvae, but instead of looking at individual larvae, I analysed an N of 8 individual brains. So this is the results for the KEGG pathway analysis. These are the gene sets that were significantly altered in at least one of the mutants. And there were 2 significantly altered gene sets in both mutants, the ribosome and oxidative phosphorylation. This was a super interesting result for us, as during my PhD, I analysed 11 different Alzheimer's disease-related genotypes in zebrafish, and these 2 gene sets were the 2 that defined the transcriptomic signature of early Alzheimer's disease. So this suggests that that changes in energy metabolism may be a common disease mechanism between Sanfilippo and Alzheimer's disease. So if you'd like more information about the transcriptomic signature of Alzheimer's disease, it's all published in that paper up on the screen. And this change in energy metabolism is something that I'm now following up a bit more closely. So I've got recently this year received a seed grant from the Flinders Foundation to collaborate with Dr. Tim McCubbin, who's a metabolic modelling expert based up in UQ. And we're doing some glucose labelling experiments and fluxomics. In the interest of time, I might skip over it a little bit, but the idea is that we've got that labelled glucose that we can detect in the brain, and we're introducing it into fish, allowing it to enter the brain, get metabolized, and we can see whereabouts in the brain energy metabolism is particularly vulnerable and whether it's altered in a similar way in both of the Alzheimer's and Sanfilippo zebrafish. We've just sent off the Alzheimer's brains for processing, so hopefully by the next year's symposium, I'll be able to share that results with you. And finally, I'd like to end with an experiment where I'm looking at whether iron supplementation could be beneficial for Sanfilippo. So for this experiment, I generated a very large family of 100 sibling fish that were either heterozygous for their NAGLU mutation, so for Sanfilippo type B, and the heterozygotes are the unaffected group in this case. And I'm comparing them to their homozygous siblings, which are the MPS IIIB model. I raised them together until they were 6 months of age. Then half of them received a vehicle control of just saline, and the other half received an iron supplement. Then I waited 7 days, and this 7-day time point was based off the literature about iron metabolism in zebrafish. Then each fish went under a behaviour test, which was a Y-maze test, and this can tell us a bit about their spatial working memory and also give us an idea of their overall activity levels. So, for example, whether they're hyperactive or not. After the behaviour test, I genotyped each fish, so I was blinded to genotype throughout the whole process, and then I sent them off for RNAseq. So the RNAseq data is currently processing on the supercomputer as we speak, so I won't be able to share that data today, but what I can show you is the behaviour test. So this graph is just showing the heterozygous unaffected fish's activity relative to the homozygous fish. And we can see that the yellow homozygous MPS IIIB fish are showing hyperactivity during this test. And when we treat the Sanfilippo fish with some iron, they start behaving more like their heterozygous unaffected siblings in a statistically significant manner. This is a super exciting result for us, as it does support that iron supplementation could be beneficial for Sanfilippo, and I can't wait to get my hands on the transcriptome data and start doing some really interesting correlations between behaviour and gene expression. So again, can't wait for next year's symposium to share that with you as well. All right, so thank you very much for listening. I'd like to thank Professor Kim Hemsley, who's taken me on as one of her postdocs, and I really appreciate the mentorship and support she's shown me so far. And of course to Michael for everything he's done to me for the last 4 odd years, and I really appreciate everything. And of course the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation for starting this journey with our Sanfilippo models. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation, Lisa, to discuss what Dementia Support Australia can support the families with. So today is I'm going to cover the non-pharmacological strategies that we support the families with. I represent Hammond Care today, and I have the privilege to work with Dementia Support Australia, supporting the childhood dementia portfolio. I work amongst a select few passionate people that are very dedicated in the work of supporting children living with dementia. So not only the Sanfilippo disease, but also other types of childhood dementia. So today I'm going to cover what is childhood dementia, the model of care that we use, the common contributing factors. I'm also going to provide a case example and how to make contact and refer, and then some time for questions after that. So DSA has a partnership with Sanfilippo Children's Foundation, Batten's Disease Support and Research Association and Childhood Dementia Initiative. We help to build the skills and knowledge within the DSA allied health team in supporting the families with children living with childhood dementia. We have nurses, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, speech pathologists, social workers, psychologists, and also dementia support workers that help provide the supports for the families. DSA can provide support over a 24/7 helpline, so any of the parents that are struggling in the middle of the night, maybe the child's having a particular behaviour, can give the helpline a call free of charge, and they can talk through some strategies with a consultant over the phone. It's government funded and it's free to the families, so it doesn't tap into any NDIS funding at all. So DSA can work with the families and the care team to provide non-pharmacological strategies with a dementia lens. So we find that in the disability sector that's covered really well with a disability focus, but they don't really touch very well on the dementia component of that disease. With the referrals we support is when there's been a change in the child's cognition and there are behaviours that the care team and the family have difficulty reducing, and the child experiences distress, and recognising the early signs that the behaviour may escalate. So it's really liaising with the family and working out a plan around supporting them with a dementia lens. So this is the biopsychosocial model of care that we use. So the assessment is in a collaboration with the family. It can be with the school, allied health team, and any specialist services to gain an understanding of the child's needs and experiences in the particular situation that could change or lead to a change in the behaviour. We focus on the possible causes of the behaviour rather than the symptoms. We have the privilege of visiting the child's home and school and to observe what may be their experiences. We find that this is most beneficial to help personalise the strategies to the child. The DSA team all understand that the parents are always the experts in the child and work in a supportive way as to what works for one may not work for another. All the children are very different. A lot of the time it is a trial and error, and at times some of the strategies that work for one may not work for the other. Predominantly, typically DSA has worked with older adults, but it seems in what we've been finding is that, and which goes along with the talks today, is there is similarities with the older adults type of dementia and what happens with the children as well. Common causes that have been similar have been under and overstimulation, unmet needs, discomfort, and discomfort can be from musculoskeletal fatigue, constipation. Care and communication approach is also another contributing factor. Older adults seem to differ when it comes to experiencing delirium and also mood disorders. That has been less likely common in children so far. Pain in older adults with dementia, we use a facial recognition tool called Pain Check that can help identify the non-verbal cues along with other non-verbal cues of pain. However, in children, there isn't an ideal measurement tool for when they have difficulty verbalising the pain as the dementia progresses. So this is, I'm marketing this for the research team to see if there's anything that they can come up with around identifying pain. Since I've got a bunch of awesome researchers in the room, that'd be really helpful to identify pain and to help when the child can no longer express pain and discomfort to the parents. So the common contributing factors from a dementia perspective that we've found are communication difficulties, especially as the language difficulties progress, sensory changes such as vision and touch, cognition changes, easily overwhelmed and can have difficulty understanding the steps. Something that they used to be able to do quite easily, they find quite challenging now, such as bathing or dressing. Comfort and engagement. Activities sometimes need to be tailored to changing capacity. Comfort could be seating, or the bed that they're currently in needs reviewing because of musculoskeletal changes, and which can also contribute to symptoms of pain. We also find that constipation is an issue as well. especially as the child's movements start to change and reduce. Also, we found the care staff, if they're involved, staff, parents, teachers, need to be educated and supported in how to apply that dementia approach in the communication strategies that we use as well. So this is just a de-identified case study that we've, as an example of a typical case that we'd come across. This Tina, she was referred to DSA as she was experiencing distress during personal care. She was also declining her medications and food. Tina was a 20-year-old and lives in a supported group home and had care staff and regular family visits. During the visit, the consultant met with the care staff and spent time observing Tina's experience during these care tasks to see what may be the cause of Tina's distress. So sometimes taking a bit of a back seat in that care environment, we've got the privilege to see what might be happening from Tina's perspective instead of that task. Care staff report that Tina was experiencing a decline in her physical function and required more help now to mobilise and dress and do other activities she once was able to do with little support. Tina's family mentioned that Tina has been a fiercely independent person all of her life and that she may be feeling that she's struggling to receive that assistance she now needs. So that lack of insight and wanting to remain as independent as possible, and she was not accepting that care and wanted to remain as independent. So the carer's communication and care approach, sometimes carers unfortunately have a task to do and they've got 5 minutes to get it done. And it's about having that backseat approach and just saying, look, okay, I think we need to slow things down. We need to slow the instructions down. Tina doesn't like being told what to do with a task. You need to reframe that and get her to, encourage her to have that independence and avoid that authoritative type language, like you need to have a shower or you need to have medications now. And that contributes to her pushing them away or telling them no. There was also discomfort on movement from the reduced function. So, the muscles were getting quite stiff and, the movement was quite painful. So it was identifying that, if they slowed things down and stopped rushing and also have, a physio review if there's any other strategies that could be used to help with that pain management as well. It was also identified that a change in routine with unfamiliar staff was also a factor. Unfortunately, the staff kept changing and that contributed to an unfamiliar approach. So having that written down in a one-pager, 5 things about Tina that's really important to know so that any staff member that could go in there could provide her with that consistent, tailored approach. Staff were mindful to have a consistent approach, even if the same staff member was unable to assist, by building rapport first. So supports for Tina. So DSA provided the carers with tailored strategies around communication with a dementia lens. DSA engaged with a behaviour support practitioner and they included the tailored dementia strategies in their behaviour plan. So sometimes, like I mentioned before, the behaviour practitioners have a really fantastic disability focus, but we are able to help add that dementia lens to her care. DSA is a short-term service, but we provide regular follow-up during the implementation of the strategies to support the staff and the family through that process. DSA was able to purchase a simulated plush dog for Tina. She loved dogs, so that helped provide her some engagement, some headphones, and also a tablet to help provide tailored engagement and assist the carers to build rapport first before engaging in any of those care tasks. So the outcomes of our supports, we found with this particular case that there was a reduction in Tina's distress during the care tasks. DSA assisted staff to build capacity and knowledge with a dementia lens. The family appreciated the emotional support throughout the referral. The behaviour practitioner reviewed the behaviour support plan and was able to include the successful approach strategies. And there was a multi-D approach to Tina's care to support her changing care needs. So that, in a snapshot, is what we're about and what we can do to support children living with dementia. It's a government-funded service, so thank you very much for the funding. It's free for the families and it doesn't tap into the NDIS funding at all. It's just an extra layer of support. So Thanks for having me today.
So thank you for the opportunity to come and present to you today. So as mentioned, I'm a paediatric respiratory and sleep physician at the Children's Hospital, and also associate professor with the Child Health Research Centre, which is where my research on sleep in children with neurodevelopmental disorders has a base. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you a little bit of background, but mainly what I'm here to do is to introduce you to a study we're running, which I hope that will be of interest to the Sanfilippo children's families. And I'm really hoping that we can engage you in this. I think it's really essential that we include not only the Sanfilippo community, but also the childhood dementia group in general. What I'm going to start with is just some basic definitions, which I'm sure will not be new to any of you. But in clinical practice, we have two sort of standardized definitions of neurodisability. The ICD-11, which is, as stated here on the slide, behavioral and cognitive disorders that arise during the developmental period and involve significant difficulties in the acquisition and execution of specific intellectual, motor, language, or social functions, or the DSM-5 definition. And if you look at across Australia, the estimates are that there is around 470,000 children, so just under thank you, just over 500,000 children in Australia with these conditions. So what conditions fall under the neurodevelopmental disorders or neurodisability banner? And I'll use these two terms interchangeably. It's actually a wide spectrum of conditions, and you can see here that we've sort of grouped them, and this is by no means all inclusive, but this is as inclusive as we could make it at this stage. You can see we have genetic syndromes, neurological conditions, developmental disorders, and then of course this group here, which is where the childhood dementia syndromes sit in this sort of neurometabolic disorders. And I know that there is some overlap between these groups as well. But the reason I put this slide up is because it's for us, it's quite important to know who we are targeting with our research. And one of the things we've tried to do is be as all-inclusive as possible, because we're very aware that research in the space of children with neurodevelopmental disorders is quite sparse, and particularly when you hone in on something like sleep, there's actually not very much that's out there. There is some studies that have been done in certain groups, but one of the things that we're really aware of is that to really be able to make an impact, we need to be able to provide some robust evidence to support change for children in all these groups in some way, shape, or form. So why on earth am I researching sleep? Well, I'm a sleep physician, which is, obviously tells you that I'm really interested in this area. I think a big thing to be aware of is that in 2019, there was a big parliamentary inquiry into sleep health. And at this point, the government recommended that sleep should be regarded as a national priority and be seen as the third pillar of health, alongside fitness and nutrition. And if you look at Australian data, sleep problems across the first 7 years of life cost roughly around $27.5 million a year. And that's in children in general. So, we're really in an area where we need to make a change. For children with neurodisability, sleep problems are highly prevalent. The estimates are that around 80% of this group of children will experience severe sleep problems. And when we did a local review of how many children we thought came to our sleep clinics at the tertiary hospitals in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane, we estimated that around a third of children that we were seeing were children with a neurodisability. I suspect it's probably getting to be more like half, but certainly a third was a sort of conservative estimate of what we were seeing. And these problems emerge early. The difference from in neurotypical children is that they persist through childhood, and they significantly impact on day-to-day function, and they can compound existing learning and behavioural issues. And I think most importantly, they profoundly impact on the quality of life for the entire family. the types of sleep problems we see are definitely not just breathing, but breathing is certainly a big part of where there's always a focus. And I think this is one of the concerns that we have. So sleep disordered breathing is certainly multifactorial in etiology. For many children in the neurodevelopmental spectrum, there are classic features that make them more at risk of sleep problems and breathing difficulties. Tone being abnormal significantly impacts. Chest wall abnormalities, disordered central control of breathing, obesity and medications all impact. And medications, I think, is a really important one to remember, can impact on a child's sleep disordered breathing risk. We also see difficulties with sleep onset. We see problems where children have a real difficulty in getting off to sleep at night. And this, I think, is a really big issue, particularly in children with childhood dementia syndromes. We also see difficulties in sleep maintenance with frequent night wakings. And again, this is a big issue. And we see circadian rhythm abnormalities. And by that, I mean irregular sleep patterns. And I think this is a really important part of what goes on for children with neurodevelopmental disorders, that there's this intrinsic abnormality in the way in which their sleep is regulated, relating to the brain dysfunction that often occurs. If you compound that with visual disturbance or hearing disturbance, these will all exacerbate and make sleep problems even more difficult. So what about in Sanfilippo syndrome specifically? Well, I haven't put huge amounts of information in here, but I have just put a few sort of highlighted studies that I think give us some useful information, which I think is important to share. So we know that sleep disturbance is actually a really central feature to Sanfilippo syndrome, and estimates are that 87 to 92% of patients will be affected. Commonly, it's frequent waking, settling difficulties, and night waking. And what I've put here on the slide is a graph that just shows you the age at which these sleep problems are beginning. And you can see that really the preschool, the 3 to 5 year old age is the kind of peak, but there is also a sort of persistence of problems at a reasonably high frequency all the way through. One of the big issues is that it's really challenging to treat these problems, and particularly in this group of children. And this study that was done now quite some time ago of 110 families reported that they really didn't describe any medication that was universally perceived by families as being beneficial. So the survey asked families about different sleep medications that they were using, and none of them came out as being the most effective, all the time. Having said that, melatonin was seen to be effective, followed by benzodiazepines, and younger children seem to get more benefit than the older children. What I've put in here is just a little bit of information about where we're going. And I really only wanted to bring this up and highlight this study at this forum, because I think it's so crucial that we target this group of children and ensure that they're included in our research. So this research is a 3-year multi-center study, which we are trying to, in the process of, the whole goal of this is to try and enable early effective sleep interventions to try and improve function and quality of life in children with neurodisability. It's being run through 3 sites, but there are other areas that are involved, and certainly in the first part of this study that I'm going to talk about, it is Australia-wide, so it is open to anyone in Australia and New Zealand. The study is being run by myself, supported by Professor Karen Waters at Children's Hospital at Westmead in Sydney, and Dr. Moya Vandeleur in the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. And our main goal is to try and see if we can modify sleep in children with neurodisability to improve their quality of life and function. And one of the reasons this is so important is that because for this group of children, often sleep is one of the few things you can actually modify and improve. And I think that's really important that we target when it can actually make a massive, massive difference. Overall, what we're intending to do is to develop some national guidelines for the diagnosis and management of sleep problems in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. And that's quite an ambitious task, because we recognise that within this group there is quite a spectrum of children with different conditions, and there is going to need to be some tailoring and some sort of decision tree approaches to this guideline that we put together. This study I put in because this is one of the few studies that's been done in children with Sanfilippo syndrome that used objective data. And what they did here is they looked at actigraphy, which is where you measure sleep patterns using a watch, and compared 8 children, although it's a small study of 8 children with age-matched controls. So it's a really nice study design. And what they showed here was that children with Sanfilippo syndrome had longer times to get off to sleep, greater daytime sleep compared to controls, and nighttime sleep did not differ in this particular study, but remembering it's only a very small study. But what they did show is they measured salivary melatonin levels and showed that there was significant circadian disruption. And that means that this group of children have an irregularity in their sleep pattern. And and that really just highlights why it's really important for us to understand more about this group of children in particular for me. So going back to our research has got 3 phases to it. The first phase is the one that we're currently sort of really focusing in on, and that's to try and improve the understanding of sleep problems in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. The second phase is really focusing on diagnosis of the sleep breathing problems and trying to find non-invasive ways in which we can measure sleep in this group of children, trying to avoid the need to do big sleep studies with lots of monitoring, which obviously are quite distressing and quite overwhelming for many children. And the last bit is really the key, which is to try and see if we can find effective interventions for these non-breathing sleep problems for children with neurodevelopmental disorders. And within this, we expect that we will be looking at tailored approaches for individual groups of children that have different sleep problems, and potentially even different approaches for different children that have different underlying conditions. So the first phase is really what I want to talk about now. And this is really about trying to understand more from you, the parents, about what's going on at the moment in terms of sleep management for children with different neurodevelopmental conditions. So we want to know how common these sleep problems are, and we are looking at both the community and also children coming to our sleep clinics. Sorry, this should say all 3 centres, not just the Queensland Children's Hospital. We are in our survey, which is what this is we are asking families about sleep health priorities for their child with neurodevelopmental disorders. So we want to know, what is it that you as families think is most important for us to prioritise for sleep in your group, in your child. And we're asking about current management strategies. So we want to know who's getting treatment, who isn't getting treatment, how are they treated, and who's managing it, and when are children actually making it to the tertiary referral centre, because we're very aware that there are many groups of children that actually we don't even get to see that we should be seeing. So this study is a large cross-sectional survey. We have an online link and we have a QR code that provides access to a suite of questionnaires, I suppose I should call it, and the data goes directly into a secure database. It is de-identified unless the participant chooses to provide their details. What we've been doing is approaching community representative organisations like the Sanfilippo Foundation and others, and asking them if they will help us to distribute these, the link and the QR code. We've been approaching families in clinics within the hospitals, and we've been recruiting a separate cohort specifically from the sleep clinics so that we can see if there's any difference between those children that are being seen in the sleep clinic versus those that aren't. Anyone who has a child with a clinician-diagnosed neurodevelopmental disorder up to the age of 18 years and is providing care as their primary caregiver can answer this questionnaire. And we are aiming big. We would like to have a minimum of 500 participants. At present, we're probably at about 100, and we hope to continue with this. In terms of what the survey consists of, there is a built-in consent form at the start of the survey. You also have an opt-in to provide details for future research. If you choose to do that, you are asked to provide your contact details, obviously. You can also opt in for your results to be sent to participants, to yourself or to the doctor, and you can provide details at that point. The first part of the questionnaire is a demographics and medical history form, where we do ask some information about the child, but as I said, we don't ask for your child's details unless you choose to provide them. We also ask a few questions about family structure. The second part is the consumer sort of priorities questionnaire, which we've designed for this study, where we ask you to rank the various different aspects of a child's sleep in terms of what you feel is most or least important for us to target in for treatment. We then have two validated sleep questionnaires, the modified Simmons and Paraga sleep questionnaire and the pediatric sleep questionnaire. These both analyze different aspects of sleep. So the first one really looks at asking about broad sleep in terms of the broad aspects of your child's sleep patterns and sleep behaviors, environment that they sleep in, things that affect their sleep. The second one is more targeting sleep breathing and is a screen to ensure that we also gain information about this aspect of sleep. We then also ask some specific questions about the sleep management that's been received, including what medications, both over the counter and prescribed, are being used. So these two questionnaires, as I mentioned, the Simmons and Paraga one has 51 parts, which sounds like a lot. The first part asks about quantity and quality of sleep. The second part is more about details specific to sleep disorders. The second one, as I've mentioned, screens for sleep disordered breathing. When we've asked people to do this, it takes about 15 to 20 minutes for this to be done. We've had patients and families give us really good feedback about the ease at which they've felt they've been able to undertake this. What we're really keen to do is engage with as many families as possible. I will be sharing this information afterwards so that this link can be distributed widely, hopefully within the community, so that we can obtain as much information as possible about the children with childhood dementia syndromes. So I'm going to stop there, and I just want to thank you for listening. I am, of course, happy to answer any questions, and I hope to have some really great insights to share with you in the future from our future work. Thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, thanks everyone. Thanks to Lisa and the Foundation for the opportunity to present this work that we've been doing using photobiomodulation to treat Sanfilippo syndrome. So this work is a collaboration between my laboratory at the University of Sydney, as well as Professor Kim Hemsley's laboratory and with Adeline Lau, and also Professor John Mitrofanis, who was formerly at the University of Sydney and is now in Grenoble in France. So you can see on this picture here, we've got some images of the mice actually receiving this photobiomodulation treatment. And there's actually two different devices that we've tested. One is a red light LED, and that emits 670 nanometers of light. And the one at the top is actually an infrared laser that emits 904 nanometers, which is actually invisible to humans. And the fact that you see that little blue LED is just to tell us that it's actually working, but it's not actually the light that's being emitted. So photobiomodulation, what actually is it? Well, it's also known as low-level light therapy, but it's essentially applying light of different wavelengths to biological tissues and looking for biological improvements in that tissue. There are particular wavelengths of light which are really effective at activating certain molecules within the tissue. And in particular, wavelengths around the red range, around sort of 670 nanometers in particular, and then the infrared range, sort of 700 to 900 nanometers seem to also be effective. And we do know now that there are particular molecules within the mitochondria which are able to accept the energy from these particular wavelengths of light and modulate the biological effects in cells. It's not specific to any one cell type. It can activate these molecules within the mitochondria within all cells, so therefore beneficial effects are sort of widespread in different cell types. So in the mitochondria, there are molecules which are important for generating ATP, and they're known as the electron transport chain. And there's one of them in particular called cytochrome C oxidase, and that's the sort of the final part of this electron transport chain. And wavelengths of the red and infrared wavelengths seem to increase the enzymatic activity of this enzyme cytochrome C oxidase, and that increases the production of ATP within the cells. So in a situation where you have sort of cellular stress, that increase in ATP allows the cell to sort of buffer some of these negative effects. And what we actually see is a change in protective transcription factors. So if we're talking about the brain, things like brain-derived neurotrophic factor and glial-derived neurotrophic factor, the production of those genes and proteins is increased. And also we see a reduction in some anti-inflammatory, a reduction in pro-inflammatory cytokines and an increase in anti-inflammatory cytokines. So it seems to have a sort of wide range of beneficial effects. So there is a huge literature in this area, and some of it, I have to say, is not of the highest quality, but there are now a number of systematic reviews which have sort of assessed the quality of the studies and have, put together, a body of work. And in the Alzheimer's disease space in animal models, there's now some good evidence that we see beneficial effects. So this systematic review highlighted 10 high-quality studies that have shown effects on the pathology of Alzheimer's disease with changes in amyloid beta, improved mitochondrial function as you'd expect, and also improvements in cognitive function, which is obviously a very important outcome in Alzheimer's disease. Also, similarly in Parkinson's disease, again, a systematic review has shown a number of high-quality studies that demonstrate, on the whole, protection of dopaminergic midbrain neurons, and these are the neurons which degenerate in Parkinson's disease. And I've actually done some work in my laboratory as well with an inflammatory model of Parkinson's disease, and we also showed neuroprotection in the midbrain. Also recently, we did a systematic review on the effects of photobiomodulation in all neurodegenerative diseases, but specifically looking at the neuroinflammatory benefits. And we identified 12 high-quality studies which showed that photobiomodulation could reduce neuroinflammation and oxidative stress in neurodegenerative diseases. And the particular mechanisms that were highlighted were increases in BDNF and GDNF, and also promotion of anti-inflammatory cytokines like IL-10 and TGF-beta. There's also been a number of studies in humans with photobiomodulation. This one shows the application of a V-Light headset, which delivers infrared light, and people with Parkinson's disease wore this for 12 weeks, and they were shown to have beneficial effects in both motor and cognitive domains. That was assessed by clinicians, and these improvements seem to last for up to a year. This was not a randomized controlled trial, so there's always a sort of caveat there, and I think we do need to do more studies where we have randomized controlled trials to show that this is effective. Also, some other evidence for anti-inflammatory effects in humans. This study was done in people with multiple sclerosis. They applied the treatment both sublingually, so under the tongue, as well as to the radial artery in the arm for 12 weeks. And they were able to show an increase in the anti-inflammatory cytokine IL-10 within the blood. Also, this has been tested in people with severe COVID. And again, application to the body, in this case to the back, showed beneficial effects in the inflammatory cytokines in people with severe COVID, and this actually had a beneficial effect on their disease. And this was actually a randomized controlled trial. So this is some quite convincing evidence that it has a biological effect in people. So why would this approach be potentially useful in Sanfilippo syndrome? Well, we all know that microglia and astrocytic activation are some of the most early signs within the mice models of Sanfilippo, and work from Kim's lab over a number of years has consistently shown astrocytic and microglial activation. Also, increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-1 and reactive oxygen species, as well as reductions in BDNF. So given what I've told you, photobiomodulation looks like it might be potentially beneficial. Also, in terms of the peripheral immune system, which is something that I'm sort of very interested in from my chronic pain background, there are also known to be changes in the peripheral immune system in Sanfilippo type 3B mice, and in particular, around from 2 months onwards, they showed that these mice had enlarged spleens, enlarged lymph nodes, an increased total number of white blood cells, and particularly an increase in activated T cells. And also that was associated with autoantibodies and the upregulation of multiple immune genes within the brains of these mice. So the peripheral immune activation appears to contribute to the brain pathology. Also, some cytotoxic proteins, which are only produced by natural killer cells and CD8 T cells, which are both types of lymphocytes, were found in the brain of MPS IIIA mice. And again, it's thought that that contributes to the pathology. So photobiomodulation in Sanfilippo syndrome, we were lucky enough to get funded by the Children's Sanfilippo Foundation back in, I think it was 2019, 2020, to do a pilot study using photobiomodulation. The foundation was central in connecting John and I with Adeline and Kim. And so we performed this pilot experiment where we applied red light at the 670 nanometer range, a dose of 2 joules per centimeter per day for 2 weeks. And this was done in pre-symptomatic mice at 3 weeks old. And we showed in this experiment there was a reduction in microglial activation within the retina. There were no changes within the glia in the brain. There was sort of maybe a slight effect on astrocytic activation, but there was nothing significant. But nevertheless, we thought because there was this small effect in the retina, it was worth following this up with another study. So because we tested the red light, the 670 nanometers light, we also wanted to try an infrared wavelength, which we hadn't tested in the pilot. And so this schematic shows you the main differences between red and infrared light. So red light has more energy than infrared light, but it's also less tissue penetrant. So you sort of have this trade-off between how much energy the chromophores, like the cytochrome C oxidase, can naturally absorb, but the downside is that energy, if it's in the red wavelength, doesn't penetrate very deeply within tissues. So the 904 penetrates more deeply but carries less energy, so less energy gets to these chromophores. So that's the sort of the trade-off. But we wanted to test both at a higher dose than what we did in the pilot study to see if we could actually see any effects within the brain. So in terms of treating the mice, we treated the head. Obviously, we wanted the energy from the light to get into the brain, so we actually did some experiments to test whether it does cross through the skull of the mice into the brain tissue, which it did. However, it's also known that you can treat remote parts of the body and you can still get a neuroprotective effect in the brain. So this is a sort of remarkable thing. You can treat the abdomen of mice with Parkinson's disease and you can still get a partial neuroprotective effect in the brain. So whilst the direct tissue penetration is important, there are clearly some other mechanisms that can elicit some of these beneficial effects. Also, the dosing is really important, and it's known that the dose response curve is biphasic. So you for any given application, there is going to be a dose which is the most therapeutic, and higher doses will actually lose those beneficial effects. If the dose is not high enough in the first place, you won't get any beneficial effects at all. So there is a certain amount of trial and error in that. But what is absolutely clear is there are no negative effects. No one has ever reported any negative effects with this treatment. So side effects are very limited. So what was the aim of this study? Well, we first wanted to determine the effects of 670 and 904 nanometers photobiomodulation on heparan sulfate accumulation and body weight in MPS IIIA mice. We believed that heparan sulfate should be increased, but we didn't believe that photobiomodulation would actually reduce this because of its effects are not directly on heparan sulfate accumulation. But secondly, we wanted to determine what the effects would be on glial activity within the retina and the brain, and also on peripheral immune cells in the MPS IIIA mice. And we know that the glial activation in the brain and the retina is increased in the mice, and we hypothesized that the photobiomodulation would reduce it, and also potentially shift these microglia or other cell types to a more anti-inflammatory phenotype. And we also thought that the photobiomodulation might reduce this peripheral immune activation, which I mentioned. So I'm now going to hand over to Adeline, and she's going to take you through the next few slides.
So Flinders did the in vivo part of the study, like we usually do. We have a naturally occurring mouse model of Sanfilippo type A, or MPS IIIA. The data we'll present today is only part of the data that we did. So it was actually quite a large study. We did a pre-symptomatic cohort and an older 15-week symptomatic cohort, but I'll only present the older cohort today. And there were 4 groups of mice. So we had our unaffected and MPS IIIA controls that didn't receive any treatment, a control group that received the LED light at 670, and a laser-treated group that received the light at 904 nanometers. These later 2 cohorts had doubled the dose that we saw in the earlier pilot study that was funded by the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation. From there, we did do some behavioural testing. I won't show you the data in the interest of time. The summary for that is because the mice were being handled up to 4 times a day, that handling had a confounding effect on the data. So it was very unclear if there was an effect. We didn't even see a difference between our 2 control groups. And then from there, we took various samples that we'd be interested in to look at. So we looked at the retina at the top, and those samples were processed here at Flinders University. And then we sent the brains and blood to University of Sydney to look at the anti-inflammatory effects there. And within the brain, Paul analysed 4 different brain regions highlighted in the different colours, and he'll present each of those when he gets to his graphs. So you can see that it's happening in more than one brain region. So to start with, we monitored the mice daily, but we also took their body weights on a weekly basis. You can see that the graphs are completely flat. It had no effect on body weight. It was very safe and well tolerated by the mice, and there weren't any adverse effects. So that's a very good sign there. And then, as Paul alluded to before, we also looked at heparan sulfate. It's the primary storage compound in these disorders. We wanted to see if there was effect. And as we usually see in these types of studies, we saw an elevation in our affected mice compared to our unaffected mice, but the 2 different PBM treatments had no difference and had no impact on heparan sulfate within the brain. From there, we turned our attention to the eye, and this work was done by Helen in our lab. And I'm only showing you a very, very small snapshot of what was done. But what she analysed is using a H&E stain is how thick the retina is. So they've previously shown in our group before that there's a retinal thinning within the eye. So the affected mice have a thinner retina. And each of the different layers within that eye, which are listed on the cartoon there, were measured. And we've only got, of the 4 different graphs, in some of the selected graphs, we can see a retinal thinning between our unaffected and our affected mice. But in these particular layers in this study, we didn't see any therapeutic effect with our retinal thinning. We also looked at the microglial activation within the retina. So we used an R-selectin B4 stain. And again, all the different retina layers were measured. And as you could see, we saw increased microglial activation. We've seen this before in our untreated mice. But in this particular study, we didn't see any impact of the photobiomodulation with either of the two devices on microglia activation. So that contrasted with the earlier study where we saw a hint of effect with the lower dose. And after this, I'll hand back to Paul to talk about brains.
Okay, so now we're showing the effect of microglial activation, and this work was done by my honours student Kevin Jin last year. And these are immunofluorescent images of IBA1 immunoreactivity, and you can see there's very little IBA1 staining in the wild type mice. There's a very large increase in the MPS IIIA mouse, and you can see that the photobiomodulation treatment, in particular the 904 nanometer application, which is the infrared laser, shows a dramatic reduction in the activation of these microglial cells in this mouse model. And these are the graphical versions of that data from the pooled animals, and you can see that significant increase between wild type and MPS IIIA, and you can see a significant reduction in activation with the 904 PBM treatment, and that was across multiple brain regions. It wasn't just in the cortex, which is obviously more superficial, it was also in deeper structures like the thalamus and the hippocampus. So it was a very wide-ranging therapeutic effect of photobiomodulation on microglial activation. But 670 nanometers, that had no effect on the microglial activation, which was similar to our pilot study with the lower dose of the 670 nanometer treatment. So we wanted to try to assess a little bit further what was going on in the microglia. And so one molecule of interest was CD206, which is it's a marker of an anti-inflammatory phenotype of microglia. So we looked at the co-expression of IBA1 and CD206 in microglia. And what we saw is that there is a reduction in this particular type of microglia. So this anti-inflammatory type of microglia appears to be reduced in the MPS IIIA mouse. And there was a particular significant reduction in one brain region, which we measured, the superior colliculus. However, there was a similar trend also in the cortex and the thalamus. However, what we noted was that CD206 was not affected by photobiomodulation. So the treatment, whilst it reduced IBA1 expression, it didn't have any effect on promoting this anti-inflammatory type of microglia, which we thought it might. So astrocyte activation, we looked at GFAP immunoreactivity within the mice, and we saw a dramatic increase in the MPS IIIA mouse. However, we didn't see any beneficial effects of either wavelength of treatment on astrocyte activation. We then went on to look at the peripheral blood in these animals using mass cytometry. It allows us to look at a large panel of different immune cell types. And what we found in this experiment was that there was an increase in CD8 T cells, CD19 B cells, and natural killer cells, which is consistent with the earlier work from the MPS IIIB mouse that I told you about. And we also noted that the 904 nanometer treatment was able to reduce specifically the natural killer cell activation. And the natural killer cell is a type of innate lymphocyte, which is involved in viral immunity, but also potentially in inflammatory diseases. So the treatment had no effect on the CD8 T cells or the CD19 B cells. So it did seem to be a selective effect on the natural killer cells. So just in summary, as expected, neither wavelength of treatment had any significant effect on heparan sulfate storage in the brain. The 904 nanometers of photobiomodulation significantly reduced microglial activation in multiple brain regions, but it had no effect in other glial cells, so the astrocytes and also the retinal microglia and astrocytes. The 670 nanometer treatment had no effects in the brain or the retina, and whilst the anti-inflammatory phenotype of microglia was reduced in the MPS IIIA mice, it was not restored by photobiomodulation. So the effect on the microglia must be by some other mechanism that we don't yet appreciate. Similar to the previous work in the MPS IIIB mouse, we've shown that immune cells, particularly CD8 T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells, were significantly increased in the MPS III mice, and the 904 nanometer treatment was able to reduce the activation of the NK cells in the blood from these mice. So quite a few promising effects in terms of peripheral inflammation and microglial activation in the brain. So I'd just like to end by thanking all the people that were involved, particularly Kevin and Jaden in my group, and obviously Kim and Adeline and Helen and Daniel in particular, who were all heavily involved in the Flinders side of the project. And also John Mitrofanis was sort of very influential in supporting and helping us plan this experiment. And finally, obviously, I'd like to thank the funding bodies for this work, which was the Cure Sanfilippo Foundation and the Save Mickey Foundation, and a little bit of support from the Neil and Norma Hill Foundation as well. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Adeline. Thanks for your time. Happy to answer questions.